November 1943, Western Front. When this disabled German soldier was captured by American forces, he prepared himself to die. Nazi propaganda had taught him that enemies would abandon wounded prisoners as useless burdens, just like his own military often did. But what happened next in that American field hospital would shatter everything he believed about war, enemy nations, and what it truly means to show strength. The question that will haunt you after hearing his story: if your worst enemies treated you better than your own people, what would that do to everything you thought you knew about right and wrong? The cold November air cut through the thin fabric of Obergefreiter Hans Müller's torn uniform as he lay crumpled against the stone wall of what used to be a farmhouse outside Monte Battaglia, Italy. The year was 1943, and the war that Adolf Hitler had promised would bring glory to the German people was slowly grinding his country into dust. Hans could hear the distant rumble of American Sherman tanks moving through the valley below, their steel tracks crushing everything in their path. His left leg was gone below the knee, blown off by an American artillery shell 3 hours earlier. The makeshift tourniquet his squad leader had tied around his thigh was already soaked through with blood. Hans pressed his back harder against the cold stone, feeling each sharp edge dig into his spine. The pain helped him stay awake. Sleep meant death, and he was not ready to die yet. For months, the German High Command had been telling soldiers like Hans exactly what to expect if captured by the Americans. The enemy were brutal savages, they said. They tortured prisoners for information, then left them to rot in filthy camps. Disabled soldiers were treated even worse. Hans had heard the stories whispered around campfires during the long retreat through Sicily. American soldiers would shoot wounded Germans rather than waste medical supplies on them. It was more merciful that way, the officers explained. The Americans saw injured enemy soldiers as nothing more than dead weight. Hans touched the small photo in his breast pocket, feeling the worn edges through the fabric. His wife Maria and their 2-year-old son Klaus stared back at him from the creased black and white image. He had not seen them in 8 months. Maria's last letter, now lost somewhere in the rubble of their destroyed supply truck, had told him that food was getting scarcer in their small Bavarian village. The bread rations had been cut again. Little Klaus was getting thinner. The sound of boots crunching on broken glass made Hans freeze. American voices drifted through the smoke-filled air, speaking in their strange, flat language. Hans could not understand the words, but he recognized the tone. They were searching the ruins, looking for survivors. His hand moved instinctively to his empty holster. He had thrown his Luger into a crater 2 kilometers back when the shrapnel had torn through his leg. Hans had grown up in a Germany where weakness was shameful. His father had served in the Great War and had taught him that a soldier's duty was to be strong, to endure pain without complaint, to never become a burden on his comrades. The Nazi Party had made these ideas even stronger. They spoke of creating a master race, of building a nation where only the fit and healthy would thrive. Hans had seen what happened to disabled veterans in his hometown. They were pushed to the edges of society, given small pensions and forgotten. Some simply disappeared. Now Hans was one of them, a broken soldier with half a leg, lying in enemy territory with no weapon and no hope of escape. According to everything he had been taught, he was worthless now. His own military would have little use for a man who could not march, could not fight, could not contribute to the war effort. And if his own people would abandon him, what mercy could he expect from the enemy? The American voices were getting closer. Hans could hear them moving through the rubble of the next room, their heavy boots scraping against chunks of concrete and twisted metal. He tried to make himself smaller, pressing deeper into the shadows behind a fallen beam. His leg throbbed with each heartbeat, sending waves of fire up his spine. Black spots danced at the edges of his vision. Through a gap in the wall, Hans caught his first glimpse of American soldiers. They were bigger than he had expected, their uniforms clean and well-fitted despite days of combat. Their helmets gleamed with a metallic shine that German equipment had lost months ago. Most shocking of all, they moved with purpose, but not cruelty. Hans had expected wild-eyed killers, but these men looked almost businesslike as they searched through the debris. One of the Americans knelt down near a pile of rubble and called out something in accented German. Hans could barely make out the words, but the tone was not threatening. The soldier was asking if anyone was injured, if anyone needed help. Hans almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Help from the enemy. It had to be a trick, a way to draw out hidden German soldiers so they could be shot more easily. But as Hans watched, something happened that made no sense according to everything he had been told about American brutality. The soldiers found a wounded Italian civilian, an old man with a gash across his forehead. Instead of ignoring him or pushing him aside, they immediately began treating his wounds. One American pulled out a white bandage from his pack and began wrapping the man's head with careful, gentle movements. Another offered the Italian water from his own canteen. Hans blinked hard, wondering if blood loss was making him see things that were not there. But the scene continued to unfold before his eyes. The Americans were actually helping an enemy civilian, using their own medical supplies, taking time away from their military objectives to care for someone who meant nothing to them. It made no sense. It went against everything Hans had been taught about how war was supposed to work. The sound of his own ragged breathing seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Hans tried to control it, but his damaged body would not obey. The black spots were growing larger, and he could feel consciousness slipping away despite his efforts to stay awake. His last thought before darkness took him was a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If these Americans were willing to help a stranger, what would they do to him? Hans woke to the strangest sensation he had felt in months. Clean sheets. The fabric against his skin was soft and white, without the rough scratches of army blankets or the grit of battlefield mud. He opened his eyes slowly, expecting to see the gray canvas of a German field hospital or perhaps the inside of a prison cell. Instead, he found himself staring at a ceiling painted bright white, with electric lights that cast a warm, steady glow across the room. The smell hit him next. Instead of the familiar stench of infection and unwashed bodies that filled German medical tents, this place smelled of soap and something else he could not identify. Something clean and sharp that made his nose tingle. Later, he would learn it was disinfectant. But for now, it simply meant that someone cared enough about cleanliness to make the air itself smell different. Hans tried to sit up and immediately felt a gentle hand on his shoulder, pushing him back down. An American soldier in a white coat stood beside his bed, but this man looked nothing like the combat troops Hans had seen in the ruins. His uniform was spotless, his face clean-shaven, and his hands were soft like a clerk's, rather than rough like a fighter's. The man spoke in broken German, his accent thick, but his words clear enough to understand. "You are safe now," the American said, checking a chart that hung at the foot of Hans's bed. "Your leg. We have cleaned the wound. No infection. You will live." Hans looked down at where his left leg should have been, and saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. The stump was wrapped in clean white bandages, layer upon layer of them, more medical supplies than Hans had seen used on a single patient in the entire war. In the German army, soldiers made do with torn shirts and dirty rags. Here the Americans had used what looked like enough bandages to treat 10 men. The American doctor noticed Hans staring and pulled up a chair beside the bed. He opened a thick folder and began showing Hans drawings of something that looked like a mechanical leg. The doctor's German was rough, but he managed to explain that they were going to fit Hans with an artificial leg, something called a prosthetic. Hans had heard of such things, but only for wealthy civilians in peacetime. The idea that enemy soldiers would spend time and money creating a new leg for a prisoner seemed impossible. Over the next 3 days, Hans discovered that the impossible was normal in this place. Meals arrived on metal trays 3 times each day, and the portions were larger than anything Hans had eaten since before the war started. Real meat, not the sawdust-filled sausages that German soldiers called food. Vegetables that were green and fresh instead of black and rotting. White bread that was soft to the touch and sweet on the tongue. On his 4th morning, Hans watched through the window as a bright red truck pulled up outside the medical building. American soldiers began unloading wooden crates, and Hans could see the familiar curved letters painted on the side. Coca-Cola. He had heard of this American drink, but had never tasted it. Within an hour, a nurse brought him a green glass bottle filled with dark, fizzing liquid. The taste was unlike anything in his experience, sweet and sharp at the same time, with bubbles that made his nose burn in a pleasant way. Hans began to notice other things that made no sense according to everything he had been taught. The American medical staff treated German prisoners exactly the same as they treated American wounded. When an American soldier in the next bed complained about his food, a nurse brought him the same meal that Hans was eating. When Hans needed help getting to the bathroom, 2 American orderlies lifted him as carefully as they would lift their own wounded comrades. Most shocking of all was the industrial kitchen that Hans could see from his window. American cooks worked with equipment that looked like something from a factory rather than a field kitchen. Massive steel pots that could feed hundreds of men at once. Refrigeration units that kept food fresh for days. Electric mixers that could blend ingredients in minutes instead of hours. The sheer scale of American abundance was overwhelming to someone who had spent months watching German supply lines collapse. The doctor, who had first treated Hans, stopped by each morning to check on his progress. His name was Captain Morrison, and he spoke about Hans's recovery as if it mattered to him personally. He explained that they were ordering a custom prosthetic leg from a factory in Ohio, and that it would take 2 weeks to arrive. Hans could not understand why these people would spend so much effort on someone who had been trying to kill them just days earlier. On his 6th day in the hospital, Hans witnessed something that shattered another piece of his understanding of the world. A group of African-American nurses arrived to help care for the wounded. Hans had been taught that Americans treated black people as slaves, that they were considered less than human. But here were black women in clean white uniforms, working alongside white doctors and nurses, treating German prisoners with the same gentle care that everyone else received. One of these nurses, a woman who could not have been much older than his wife Maria, spent extra time helping Hans learn to balance on crutches. She spoke no German, but her smile needed no translation. When Hans fell during his first attempt to walk, she helped him up without a trace of impatience or anger. She treated him with more kindness than some German officers had shown their own men. Hans began to lie awake at night, staring at the clean white ceiling and trying to make sense of what he was experiencing. Everything his government had told him about Americans was proving to be wrong. They were not savage killers who tortured prisoners. They were not wasteful people who threw away resources on useless things. Instead, they seemed to believe that every human life had value, even the life of an enemy soldier who could no longer fight. The abundance was almost frightening in its scale. Hans calculated that the medical supplies used on him alone would have been enough to treat 50 German soldiers. The food he ate in one day was more than many German civilians saw in a week. And yet, the Americans acted as if this level of care was normal, as if treating enemies with dignity was simply the right thing to do. As Hans watched American doctors work to save the lives of German prisoners, he began to wonder about something that would change his understanding of everything. If these people treated their enemies this well, how did they treat their own citizens? What kind of society could produce such wealth, such organization, such fundamental respect for human life? And what did that say about the society that had sent him to fight against them? The moment that would change Hans Müller forever came on a cold Thursday morning in late November, exactly 3 weeks after his capture. He had been fitted with his new prosthetic leg the day before, a marvel of American engineering that weighed only 4 pounds, but felt solid as steel beneath him. The artificial limb had been crafted in a factory in Ohio specifically for his measurements, shipped across an ocean at war, and fitted by specialists who treated him as if he were their own brother returning from battle. Hans was still learning to walk with his new leg when Captain Morrison appeared at his bedside with an unusual request. The Americans were celebrating something called Thanksgiving, their doctor explained in his careful German. It was a holiday where they gave thanks for their blessings and shared a feast with everyone around them. Hans would be welcome to join the celebration in the main dining hall, not as a prisoner forced to watch, but as an invited guest at their table. The idea seemed impossible. Hans had spent 2 years fighting these people, trying to kill them, following orders to destroy everything they valued. Now, they wanted him to sit at their table and share their most important meal of the year. He tried to refuse, certain it must be some kind of test or trap, but Captain Morrison's smile was so genuine that Hans found himself nodding yes before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. That afternoon, Hans made his way slowly down the hospital corridor, his new leg clicking softly against the polished floor with each step. The main dining hall had been transformed into something that looked more like a palace than a military facility. Long tables covered with white cloth stretched across the room, set with real plates and silverware that caught the light from dozens of electric bulbs hanging overhead. The smell that filled the air was rich and warm, nothing like the thin soup and stale bread that had become normal for Hans over the past year. American soldiers sat alongside German prisoners at the same tables, sharing the same food from the same serving dishes. Hans watched in amazement as enemy soldiers passed bowls of food to the men who had been shooting at them just weeks earlier. There was no separation, no special prisoner section, no guards standing over them with weapons. Just men eating together as if the war had never happened. The food itself was beyond anything Hans could have imagined. Turkey so tender it fell apart when touched with a fork. Sweet potatoes covered in butter that melted on his tongue. Cranberry sauce that was both tart and sweet at the same time. Green beans that were actually green instead of the gray mush he had eaten for months. Bread rolls so fresh they were still warm from the oven. Hans ate slowly, trying to make each bite last, knowing that this level of abundance could not be real. But it was the pies that broke something inside Hans's understanding of the world. Apple pie, pumpkin pie, and something called pecan pie that was sweeter than any dessert he had ever tasted. The American cook, a cheerful man with flour still dusting his apron, explained through a translator that he had made 37 pies for the celebration. 37 pies, Hans repeated to himself. In Germany, sugar was so rare that his own mother had not baked a cake in over a year. Here, the Americans were making dozens of desserts for a single meal and serving them to enemy prisoners as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Hans found himself seated next to a young American soldier named Tommy from a place called Iowa. Tommy had been wounded in the same battle where Hans lost his leg, and now they sat side by side, sharing stories through a mix of broken German and simple English. Tommy showed Hans pictures of his family farm, with fields of corn that stretched to the horizon and cattle that looked fat and healthy. Hans shared his own photo of Maria and Klaus, watching as Tommy's face lit up with the same proud smile that Hans wore when talking about his son. The conversation around the table grew louder and more friendly as the evening wore on. Hans listened to American soldiers talking about their homes, their dreams for after the war, their worries about family members serving in other parts of the world. These were not the savage killers that German propaganda had described. They were farmers and factory workers, students and shop clerks, men who missed their mothers and worried about their sweethearts, just like German soldiers did. As the meal continued, Hans noticed something that made his chest tighten with confusion and shame. An American corporal named Jackson, whose dark skin marked him as one of the men Hans had been taught to see as inferior, was teaching a group of German prisoners how to play a card game called poker. Jackson's hands moved with quick confidence as he dealt the cards, explaining the rules in patient, simple German that he had learned just for this purpose. When one of the German prisoners made a mistake, Jackson laughed good-naturedly and helped him understand the correct play. Hans watched this scene with growing bewilderment. In Germany, he had been told that black Americans were treated like animals, that they were stupid and dangerous, that they lived in fear and misery. But here was a black soldier who spoke multiple languages, who had learned German specifically to communicate with enemy prisoners, who treated German soldiers with more kindness than some German officers showed their own men. Jackson's uniform was as clean and well-fitted as any white soldier's. His equipment was identical, and the other Americans clearly respected him as an equal. The moment of complete ideological collapse came when Hans excused himself to visit the bathroom and got lost in the hospital corridors. His new prosthetic leg was still unfamiliar, and he moved slowly down the wrong hallway, looking for someone to ask for directions. Through an open doorway, he saw something that made him stop and stare. A German prisoner. A man Hans recognized as Sergeant Weber from his own regiment was lying unconscious on an operating table. Weber had been captured 3 days earlier with severe internal injuries, wounds that would have meant certain death in any German field hospital. But here, an entire team of American doctors and nurses were working to save his life. Hans could see expensive equipment humming and blinking around Weber's body, machines that cost more than most German soldiers earned in a year. What shattered Hans's understanding completely was the sight of the lead surgeon, an older American doctor with gray hair and tired eyes, carefully stitching Weber's torn intestines back together. The operation had clearly been going on for hours, and this doctor was using his skill and America's precious medical supplies to save the life of an enemy soldier who would never be able to fight again. Weber would survive, but he would be permanently disabled, unable to work or contribute anything to the war effort. According to everything Hans had been taught about military logic and racial superiority, this operation made no sense. Weber was now useless as a soldier and a burden on whoever had to care for him. The rational thing would be to let him die and save the medical supplies for someone who could still fight. That was what German military doctrine taught, what Nazi ideology demanded, what Hans had accepted as normal for his entire adult life. But these Americans were spending thousands of dollars and countless hours of skilled labor to save a man who could never repay them, who had been their enemy just days earlier, who would require care and support for the rest of his life. They were doing it not because Weber was valuable to them, not because he could help them win the war, but simply because they believed his life had worth. Hans slumped against the wall, his artificial leg suddenly feeling heavy and awkward beneath him. The tears came again, harder this time, great shaking sobs that he could not control. He was not crying for Weber, though he was grateful his fellow soldier would live. He was crying for himself, for the man he had been, for the beliefs that had shaped his entire understanding of right and wrong. Captain Morrison found Hans there 20 minutes later, still leaning against the wall, with tears streaming down his face. The American doctor did not ask what was wrong or demand an explanation. He simply helped Hans back to his room. Walking slowly to match the pace of the prosthetic leg, offering his arm for support when Hans stumbled. That night, Hans lay in his clean hospital bed and tried to write a letter to Maria. He wanted to tell her about the Thanksgiving dinner, about the American soldiers who had become his friends, about the society he had discovered that treated enemies better than Germany treated its own disabled veterans. But every time he tried to find the words, he realized how impossible it would be for her to believe. How could he explain that the Americans had spent more money on his artificial leg than his family had seen in 5 years? How could he describe a country so wealthy that they threw away more food each day than most German families ate in a month? How could he make her understand that the enemy they had been fighting was not a nation of brutal savages, but a people who believed that every human life, even a German life, deserved dignity and care? Hans finally put down his pen and stared out the window at the American flag flying over the hospital compound. The stars and stripes moved gently in the night breeze, lit by electric lights that burned all night long because these people had so much power that they never needed to worry about conserving energy. He thought about the German flag, with its twisted cross and promises of racial superiority, and wondered how he had ever believed that hatred and cruelty could build a better world. The question that had been growing in his mind for weeks was now impossible to ignore. If America treated its enemies this well, what did that say about everything he had been fighting for? And more frightening still, what would he find when he returned to a Germany that had taught him to see compassion as weakness and mercy as foolishness? Hans closed his eyes and tried to imagine explaining to his son Klaus that the Americans he had been sent to kill were actually the most decent people he had ever met. The thought terrified him more than any artillery barrage ever had. The train that carried Hans Müller back to Germany in March 1946 was nothing like the clean, efficient transport he had expected based on his American experience. The wooden seats were cracked and uncomfortable, the windows were cloudy with grime, and the car smelled of unwashed bodies and stale cigarettes. Hans shifted his weight carefully, adjusting his American-made prosthetic leg in the cramped space between seats. The artificial limb still worked perfectly after more than a year of use, its metal joints moving smoothly and silently with each step he took. In his worn canvas bag, Hans carried the physical reminders of his time in American captivity. A small bottle of aspirin that Captain Morrison had given him for the phantom pain in his missing leg. A folded piece of paper with Tommy's address in Iowa, along with a promise to write letters about life after the war. 3 photographs that American soldiers had taken of the Thanksgiving dinner, showing Hans sitting at the same table as his former enemies, all of them smiling like old friends. Most precious of all was the letter of recommendation that Captain Morrison had written in careful German script. The letter explained Hans's medical condition and praised his character, suggesting that any employer would be lucky to have such a dedicated worker. Hans had read the letter so many times that he had memorized every word, but he still pulled it out occasionally to make sure it was real. No German officer had ever written such a letter about a disabled soldier. Hidden deeper in his bag was something even more valuable, a small notebook filled with his own handwriting, documenting everything he had witnessed during his captivity. Hans had written down the details of every meal, every medical treatment, every conversation with American soldiers. He had sketched the hospital equipment, recorded the names of medicines, and described the industrial kitchen that could feed thousands of men each day. The notebook was his proof that what he had experienced was real, not some fever dream brought on by blood loss and trauma. The train wheezed to a stop at the bombed remains of Munich's main station, and Hans gathered his few belongings and stepped onto the platform. The contrast hit him immediately, like a physical blow to the chest. Where American train stations had been busy with well-dressed people carrying leather suitcases and talking about business trips, this platform was filled with hollow-eyed refugees clutching cardboard boxes and cloth bundles. Children with thin faces and patched clothes pressed close to their mothers, and old men leaned heavily on wooden crutches that looked like they had been carved from tree branches. Hans limped through the crowd, his American prosthetic clicking against the broken concrete. People stared at his artificial leg with a mixture of envy and suspicion. Prosthetic limbs were rare in Germany, available only to the very wealthy or those with powerful connections. Most disabled veterans made do with wooden peg legs or simple crutches if they were lucky enough to have anything at all. An old woman with missing teeth pointed at Hans's prosthetic and asked loudly how he had gotten such expensive equipment. When Hans mumbled something about military medical care, she laughed bitterly and showed him her husband's crude wooden peg leg. "My Johann lost his leg at Stalingrad," she said. "The army gave him a piece of firewood and told him to be grateful he was alive. Where did you serve, that they gave you such a fine leg?" Hans could not answer without revealing the truth about his American captivity, so he simply nodded and moved on. But the encounter showed him something he had not expected. His artificial leg marked him as different, as someone who had received special treatment that other German veterans had been denied. The very thing that proved American generosity to him appeared to other Germans as evidence of unfair privilege. The bus ride to his village took 3 hours instead of the normal 1 hour, stopping frequently when the engine overheated or when bomb craters in the road forced long detours through farm fields. Hans watched the German countryside roll past the dirty windows and felt his heart sink with each mile. Fields that should have been green with spring crops were brown and empty. Farmhouses stood with their roofs caved in and their walls pocked with bullet holes. Entire villages had been reduced to piles of rubble with a few surviving chimneys pointing toward the gray sky like broken fingers. At one stop, Hans watched a group of German children searching through a garbage pile behind a small store, looking for scraps of food or anything useful they could trade. The oldest child could not have been more than 10 years old, but he moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had been hungry for a very long time. Hans thought about the American children he had seen in photographs that soldiers shared, healthy and smiling, playing with toys and eating ice cream. The contrast made his stomach turn. Maria was hanging laundry on a rope stretched between two trees when Hans finally walked up the dirt path to their small house. She looked older than her 26 years. Her hair now streaked with gray, and her dress hanging loose on her thin frame. Little Klaus, now almost 4 years old, peeked out from behind his mother's skirt, with eyes that seemed too large for his pale face. The reunion was not the joyful homecoming that Hans had imagined during his long months in the American hospital. Maria's embrace was hesitant and brief, as if she was not sure whether this man with the artificial leg and the strange stories was really her husband. Klaus would not come near him at first. Scared by the clicking sound of the prosthetic and confused by his father's tales of enemy soldiers who had treated him like family. Hans tried to share his American medicines and the small gifts he had brought home, but Maria's reaction was not what he expected. When he offered her the aspirin, she asked suspiciously where he had gotten such expensive medicine. When he showed her the photographs of the Thanksgiving dinner, she stared at them for a long moment before asking why he was smiling while sitting with men who had been trying to kill Germans. The hardest moment came when Hans tried to explain what he had learned about American society and how it had changed his understanding of the war. Maria listened in silence as he described the abundance of food, the quality of medical care, and the dignity with which prisoners had been treated. When he finished, she was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "Hans," she said carefully, "you must not tell these stories to other people in the village. They will think the Americans did something to your mind while you were captured. People here have lost their sons and fathers fighting against these Americans. They will not want to hear that our enemies were kind to you." Hans realized that his wife was right, but the knowledge felt like another wound in his chest. He had returned home carrying the truth about what he had experienced, but it was a truth that his own people could not accept. The contrast between American abundance and German scarcity was too great. The difference in how the two societies treated their weakest members too stark. The gap between propaganda and reality too wide for most Germans to bridge. That first week home, Hans made a terrible mistake. At the village tavern, loosened by beer and desperate to share his experiences with someone, he began telling another veteran about the American hospital. He described the clean sheets, the abundant food, the careful medical treatment he had received. The other man, who had lost an arm at Normandy and received no prosthetic replacement, listened with growing anger. "You sound like you enjoyed being captured," the man finally said loudly enough for the entire tavern to hear. "Maybe you should have stayed with your American friends if they treated you so well." The room fell silent, and Hans felt every eye in the place staring at him with suspicion and disgust. He left without finishing his beer and never spoke publicly about his captivity again. Over the following months, Hans found work as a clerk in the village government office, using Captain Morrison's letter of recommendation to convince the local officials that his disability would not prevent him from doing good work. He was one of the few disabled veterans in the area who had a steady job, and he knew it was because of the American doctor's faith in his abilities. The work brought Hans face to face with the devastating reality of post-war Germany. Every day, widows came to his desk asking about pension payments that never arrived. Disabled veterans filled out forms for medical care that the government could not provide. Families applied for housing assistance after their homes had been bombed, but there were no resources to help them rebuild. Hans processed these applications with growing shame, knowing that America had the resources to solve these problems, but that his own country had squandered its strength on a war that had brought nothing but misery. Hans began quietly helping other disabled veterans in his community, sharing his American medicines and teaching them exercises that the physical therapists in the hospital had shown him. He never told them where he had learned these techniques, simply saying that he had picked them up during his recovery. He used his small salary to buy extra food for families with wounded fathers, remembering the abundance he had witnessed and feeling ashamed that his own country could not provide similar care for its veterans. The most difficult case was Sergeant Weber, the man whose life American doctors had saved during that long operation Hans had witnessed. Weber had indeed survived, but he had returned to Germany with severe intestinal damage that required constant medical care. The German medical system had no resources to help him, and Weber was slowly dying from complications that could have been easily treated in an American hospital. Hans visited Weber regularly, bringing him small portions of his American medicines and sitting with him during his worst pain. Weber never knew that Hans had watched American doctors save his life, or that those same doctors would have continued caring for him if he had remained in captivity. Hans kept that knowledge to himself, but it ate at him like acid. Here was a man whose life had been saved by enemy generosity, now dying because his own country could not match that level of care. At night, Hans would sit at his kitchen table and write letters to Tommy in Iowa, carefully crafting each sentence to avoid mentioning military details that censors might find suspicious. Tommy wrote back with stories about planting corn and fixing farm equipment, casual mentions of buying new clothes and taking his girlfriend to moving picture shows. The letters painted a picture of normalcy and prosperity that seemed like fairy tales compared to the reality of post-war Germany. One letter from Tommy included a small photograph of his family's Thanksgiving dinner in 1947. Hans stared at the image for hours, comparing it to the meal he had shared with American soldiers 2 years earlier. The abundance was the same, tables groaning under the weight of food, people with healthy, well-fed faces, children playing with toys while adults talked and laughed. Tommy's family was celebrating in peacetime what Hans had experienced as a prisoner of war, and both meals showed the same incredible wealth and generosity. Hans tried to imagine a similar photograph taken in his own village. German families still gathered around tables with empty plates, still told children that there would be more food someday, still made meals from scraps and hoped that things would get better. The contrast was so sharp that Hans sometimes wondered if he had imagined his entire American experience. Klaus gradually grew used to his father's artificial leg and began asking questions about the clicking sound it made when Hans walked. Hans would lift his son onto his lap and explain how American doctors had made the leg specially for him, how they had measured every part of his remaining limb to make sure it fit perfectly, how they had spent more money on this one artificial leg than most German families earned in an entire year. "Why did the Americans help you, Papa?" Klaus asked one evening as they sat together watching the sunset. "Were you friends with them?" Hans was quiet for a long moment, thinking about how to answer a question that still confused him. "No, Klaus," he finally said. "We were enemies when they found me. They helped me because they believed that all people deserve to be helped, even their enemies. They showed me that being strong does not mean hurting people who are weaker than you. Being truly strong means using your power to lift up everyone around you." As Klaus grew older, Hans began teaching him the lessons he had learned from American captivity, without revealing where those lessons came from. He taught his son to share his food with children who had less, to help older people who struggled with heavy loads, to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their background or beliefs. When Klaus asked why these things were important, Hans would simply say that taking care of others was what separated good people from bad people. The most profound change in Hans came during the winter of 1948, when a harsh cold snap killed dozens of elderly people in the surrounding villages. Hans organized a relief effort, using his government position to coordinate donations of food and fuel. He worked 18-hour days, limping from house to house on his artificial leg, checking on families and distributing supplies. When people asked why he was working so hard to help others, Hans remembered Captain Morrison spending his own money to buy Hans extra medicine, and Tommy sharing his family photographs with a man who had been trying to kill Americans just weeks earlier. Years later, when Klaus was old enough to understand, Hans would tell him the full story of what he had experienced in American captivity. He would explain how that Thanksgiving dinner had taught him that a nation's true strength was not measured by how effectively it could destroy its enemies, but by how much dignity it showed to those who had no power to defend themselves. Hans never returned to America, but he carried its lessons with him for the rest of his life. He became known in his village as a man who would help anyone in need, regardless of their politics or their past. When people asked why he was so generous with his time and resources, Hans would simply say that he had learned during the war that showing kindness to others was not a sign of weakness, but the truest measure of strength. The artificial leg that American doctors had crafted for him lasted for over 20 years, clicking softly with each step, as a constant reminder of the day his understanding of human nature had been forever changed. When the prosthetic finally wore out, Hans kept it in his closet, unable to throw away the physical proof that his enemies had treated him better than his own people treated their disabled veterans. And when Hans finally told his grandchildren about his experience as a prisoner of war, he would end the story with the same words every time. "I went to fight against America and came home knowing that the real enemy had always been the hatred in my own heart. The Americans showed me that the strongest people are those who use their strength to lift up others, even those who have wronged them. That is the lesson I want you to remember long after I am gone." In his final years, Hans would often sit in his garden and think about the two paths that nations could choose. They could follow the German example of his youth, using their power to crush the weak and glorify the strong, building a society where only the perfect were valued and the disabled were discarded. Or they could follow the American example he had witnessed, using their abundance to care for everyone, even their enemies, building a society where every person's life had worth regardless of their ability to contribute. Hans chose to spend the rest of his life proving that the second path was not only possible, but necessary for any society that wanted to call itself truly civilized. And every click of his American-made prosthetic leg served as a reminder that sometimes our greatest teachers are the people we once considered our enemies.